The 911 dispatcher thought it was just another entitled complaint until the caller said, "I want her removed from my property immediately." What no one on that call realized was that the woman being targeted wasn't powerless, wasn't trespassing, and wasn't afraid. She was the commanding authority of the state police. And this single phone call would ignite a chain reaction no HOA handbook could protect anyone from. It was a quiet morning at our lake property, the kind of calm that feels rare and earned. The water was still, birds echoed across the trees, and my wife stood on the dock reviewing notes on her tablet. She was off duty, dressed casually, enjoying a moment of peace before the week ahead. That peace shattered when a sharp voice cut through the air like a siren. A woman stormed down the gravel path, phone in hand, sunglasses perched like armor. She didn't introduce herself politely. She announced herself. HOA President. Authority. Rules. Violations. She claimed my wife didn't belong there and demanded immediate compliance. My wife responded calmly, explaining that the property was privately owned and not governed by the HOA. That explanation was met with laughter. "I've already called 911, the woman said smugly. "They'll handle you." Neighbors began to gather. Phones came out. Whispers spread. The HOA Karen stood taller with every second, confident the system would bend for her like it always had before. My wife, however, didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply waited. Sirens approached. The sound energized the crowd. When the patrol cars arrived, the officers stepped out ready to de-escalate until they saw her. One officer stopped cold. Another went silent. Recognition hit instantly. This wasn't a civilian dispute. This was a disaster unfolding in real time. The HOA president demanded arrests, waving her hand toward my wife like she was pointing out trash on the roadside. Instead, the officers straightened. My wife calmly identified herself. No drama. No threats. Just facts. The air changed. Radios crackled softly. One officer stepped back. Another nodded respectfully. The woman's confidence collapsed as confusion and fear replaced her smug certainty. She tried to speak but couldn't form the words. Then the unthinkable happened. Additional vehicles arrived, state command units. Not backup. Oversight. In that moment, everyone watching understood something important. Power doesn't shout. It waits. And once challenged, it responds with absolute clarity. The HOA president didn't call for help that morning. She called for accountability. The moment the state command vehicles rolled in, the atmosphere shifted from gossip to gravity. Neighbors who had been whispering suddenly went quiet, phones lowering as they realized this was no longer casual drama. This was official. Heavy. Real. The HOA president glanced around, searching for reassurance, but found none. The confidence she'd worn like armor began to crack. An officer from the first patrol car approached my wife, posture rigid, voice respectful. He confirmed her identity quietly, almost apologetically, then stepped aside. That single movement spoke louder than any argument. Authority had chosen its side, and it wasn't the one shouting. The HOA Karen tried to regain control. She insisted there had been a mistake, that she was just following procedure, that someone like my wife should understand rules. Her voice trembled now, the edge gone. My wife listened without interrupting, hands relaxed at her sides. When the woman finished, my wife asked one simple question: who authorized you to remove someone from private property? Silence followed. The HOA president fumbled through words about bylaws and neighborhood standards, but nothing landed. A state police commander stepped forward, requesting the incident number from the 911 call. Another officer documented statements. What had started as a power play was now a formal investigation. Neighbors watched as the narrative flipped in real time. The woman who'd marched in expecting obedience now stood cornered by her own assumptions. She kept repeating that she didn't know. That she had no idea. That phrase echoed in the air like a confession. My wife finally spoke clearly, calmly, and with unmistakable authority. She explained that misuse of emergency services is not only unethical, but illegal. That falsely reporting trespassing carries consequences. That calling law enforcement to intimidate someone is not governance, it's abuse. The HOA president's face drained of color. She asked if she could just talk this out. The commander shook his head. This was no longer optional. A written warning became a formal citation. A citation became a referral. Each step documented. Each decision measured. No raised voices. No spectacle. Just process. What shocked everyone most was my wife's restraint. She didn't gloat. She didn't lecture. She didn't enjoy the moment. She treated it like any other abuse of authority case. Because to her, that's exactly what it was. The neighbors began to understand something deeper. Power isn't about titles or loud demands. It's about responsibility, accountability, and knowing when to step back. As officers prepared to leave, the HOA president stood frozen, clutching her phone like it might save her. But the call she made had already sealed her fate. And this was only the beginning. News of what happened at the lake spread faster than anyone expected. By that evening, group chats were buzzing, neighbors were replaying clips, and rumors were colliding with facts. The HOA president tried to control the narrative, sending out a carefully worded email claiming there had been a minor misunderstanding. But the truth had already escaped her reach. 2 nights later, the emergency HOA meeting was packed. People who had never attended before filled every chair, some standing along the walls. The president sat at the front table, posture stiff, smile forced, papers neatly stacked like armor. She opened the meeting with procedural language, hoping structure would restore authority. It didn't. The first homeowner raised a hand and asked a simple question: why were police called on a resident without verification? The president deflected, citing safety concerns. Another homeowner followed up, asking why the property in question wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. Murmurs spread. Phones recorded quietly. Then someone played a video. The footage wasn't dramatic, but it was devastating. It showed the president demanding removal, refusing explanation, and smirking as sirens approached. It showed the moment officers recognized my wife. It showed the shift. The room went quiet. The president tried to interrupt, but voices rose. Questions stacked. Why were dues being used to fund legal overreach? Why were emergency services misused? Why had residents never been told the limits of HOA authority? She stumbled through answers, contradicting herself. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't a one-time lapse. Patterns emerged. Previous fines. Threatening notices. Intimidation dressed up as compliance. Then my wife stood. She hadn't planned to speak, but silence felt heavier than words. She introduced herself plainly, without rank, without emphasis. She explained what lawful authority looks like, and how easily it can be abused when unchecked. She didn't accuse. She clarified. That was worse. The room shifted. People nodded. Some looked angry. Others embarrassed. The president's gavel hit the table repeatedly, but order didn't return. A motion was called for an internal review. Another for temporary suspension of enforcement actions. Then a vote of no confidence. The president protested, voice cracking, insisting she was being attacked unfairly. But the vote passed overwhelmingly. The gavel fell one last time, not in control, but in defeat. When the meeting ended, people lingered, talking quietly, processing what they'd witnessed. The illusion of power had shattered. What remained was accountability. Outside, the president avoided eye contact, slipping past neighbors who no longer stepped aside for her. She had wanted someone removed that morning. Instead, she had removed herself. The days after the HOA meeting felt strangely quiet, like the calm after a storm when everyone is afraid to speak too loudly. The former president stopped sending emails. Enforcement notices vanished. Even the tone of neighborhood conversations changed, softer and more cautious, as if people were relearning where authority actually lived. Then the official letters arrived. First came notice from the county, requesting HOA records related to complaints, fines, and emergency calls. Then a separate letter addressed the misuse of public resources. What many neighbors didn't realize was that once a 911 call is flagged as potentially false or abusive, it doesn't simply disappear. It follows a process. And this one was already moving. The former president attempted damage control. She knocked on doors, offered explanations, insisted she'd only meant to keep the neighborhood safe. But safety doesn't involve intimidation, and leadership doesn't hide behind emergency lines. Each conversation ended the same way, polite listening, followed by distance. At home, my wife reviewed the case like any other. No emotion. No grudges. Just facts. Patterns emerged quickly. Similar complaints. Similar language. Similar overreach. This wasn't about one morning at the lake. That moment had only exposed what had been happening quietly for years. A formal inquiry was opened. The HOA's legal counsel advised cooperation. Records were requested. Communications reviewed. Training or lack of it was noted. The idea that an HOA president could command law enforcement was dismantled line by line. Authority, it turned out, doesn't come from a title printed on letterhead. Neighbors began sharing their own stories. Unjust fines. Threatening letters. Fear of retaliation. What had once felt isolated now looked systemic. And systems don't survive sunlight. The former president's tone shifted again, from defensive to desperate. She claimed stress. Misunderstanding. Burnout. But responsibility doesn't evaporate when pressure appears. It reveals character. One afternoon, as state investigators concluded their interviews, my wife received a quiet thank you from a homeowner who'd been afraid to speak for years. That mattered more than any headline. By the end of the week, the HOA announced interim leadership and suspended enforcement actions pending review. The neighborhood exhaled collectively. The woman who had once stood on the dock, phone raised, demanding removal, now avoided the lake entirely. She had tried to use authority she didn't have. And learned that consequences don't require permission. By the following week, the neighborhood no longer felt like the same place. Where there had once been quiet compliance, there was now cautious confidence. People waved more. Conversations lasted longer. For the first time, residents realized they weren't alone, and that realization changed everything. The interim HOA leadership called a town hall meeting, open to everyone, no closed doors, no rushed agendas. The contrast was immediate. Chairs were arranged in a circle instead of rows. Notes were taken publicly. Questions were encouraged, not dismissed. It felt less like governance and more like community. One by one, homeowners spoke. A retired couple described fines for invisible violations. A single mother explained how threatening letters had pushed her to tears. A young family shared how they'd been warned against causing trouble for asking simple questions. Each story stripped away another layer of the illusion that the former president's behavior had been isolated. What shocked many was how normalized the fear had become. People had adjusted their lives to avoid conflict, believing resistance would only make things worse. Hearing others speak broke that spell. The interim board acknowledged mistakes openly. They admitted the HOA had drifted from its purpose. They promised transparency, audits, and revised policies. For the first time in years, No one rolled their eyes. Trust, though fragile, began to rebuild. Outside the meeting, my wife stood quietly, observing. She wasn't there as an officer or authority. She was there as a neighbor. Several people thanked her not for what she'd done on the dock, but for how she'd handled it. Calm. Professional. Fair. That restraint had made all the difference. Had she reacted emotionally, the story would have fractured. Instead, clarity prevailed. Meanwhile, the former president's world continued to shrink. Invitations stopped. Conversations ended abruptly. The respect she'd demanded through force was gone, replaced by silence. Not cruelty, distance. She sent one final message to the community, apologizing if anyone felt uncomfortable. The wording didn't land. Accountability requires more than conditional regret. By the end of the month, formal findings were released. Misuse of emergency services. Abuse of position. Failure to follow jurisdictional boundaries. Consequences followed quietly, without spectacle. The lake returned to stillness. Mornings felt peaceful again. But something fundamental had changed. People understood now that authority without understanding is dangerous, and power without accountability is temporary. That morning on the dock hadn't just stopped one bad call. It had ended an era of unchecked control. As weeks passed, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, but the impact of that single morning continued to ripple outward. Policies were rewritten. Training sessions were scheduled. The HOA's new leadership worked carefully, almost cautiously, aware that trust once broken is not easily restored. Every decision was documented. Every rule explained. For many residents, this transparency felt unfamiliar. Authority that explained itself was something they hadn't experienced before. And that difference mattered. The former president, however, struggled to adapt. Without a title, without instant compliance, she found herself invisible. The same people who once avoided eye contact now spoke freely around her. It wasn't revenge. It was reality reasserting itself. One afternoon, a state investigator followed up with my wife, confirming final recommendations. No criminal charges, but mandatory penalties, training requirements, and permanent notation regarding the misuse of emergency services. Enough to ensure the behavior would not repeat by her or anyone watching closely. That was the point. My wife declined public recognition. She didn't want interviews or attention. To her, the case had never been personal. It was procedural. Abuse of authority is dangerous whether it comes from a badge or a clipboard. That perspective resonated. Other neighborhoods began reaching out, asking questions about boundaries and rights. Quiet conversations turned into shared knowledge. What had happened at our lake became a lesson without needing to be a headline. At home, we talked about it rarely. Life moved forward. But occasionally, while walking the dock at sunrise, my wife would pause, listening to the water. That morning had reminded her why restraint mattered. Power used correctly is almost invisible. Used incorrectly, it destroys trust instantly. The HOA began publishing monthly reports. Complaints dropped. Participation increased. People felt safe enough to engage again. The community hadn't just survived the incident, it had matured. One evening, I noticed the former president watching the lake from a distance, standing alone. She didn't approach. She didn't speak. She simply looked. Maybe she was reflecting. Maybe she was regretting. Or maybe she was finally understanding that authority borrowed through intimidation never lasts. The lesson had been costly, but clear. You cannot command respect by dialing a phone. You earn it by knowing your limits. And sometimes, the strongest response to a misuse of power is calm, patient accountability delivered without anger, but with certainty. That morning changed many lives. Not because someone shouted louder, but because someone knew exactly when to speak. The apology arrived quietly, not in a meeting or an email blast, but in a sealed envelope slipped into our mailbox one afternoon. No return address. No HOA letterhead. Just a single page folded carefully, as if presentation could soften what words alone could not. The former president wrote that she had been under pressure, overwhelmed by responsibility, convinced that control was the same as leadership. She said she never meant for things to go as far as they did. She admitted fear had driven her more than authority. The letter ended with a request for understanding. My wife read it once, then set it down. Regret, when it arrives after consequences, carries a different weight. It may be sincere, but it no longer has the power to undo damage. Accountability had already moved forward, independent of emotion. And that distinction mattered. The neighborhood continued changing in subtle ways. People spoke up sooner. Questions were welcomed instead of punished. The new HOA leadership held open sessions where residents could challenge decisions without fear. That culture shift was the real outcome, not the investigations, not the meetings, not even the dramatic morning at the lake. Several neighbors asked my wife how she stayed so calm that day. She answered honestly. Years of command teach you something important: when you react emotionally, you give away control. When you respond deliberately, you shape outcomes. That lesson spread. A nearby community invited her to speak not as a police commander, but as someone who understood systems and boundaries. She declined formal speaking roles but encouraged local leaders to educate themselves. Authority without knowledge is dangerous. Authority without humility is worse. Meanwhile, the former president faded from community life. She attended fewer gatherings, kept to herself, avoided discussions about the HOA entirely. Not because she was shunned, but because the environment no longer rewarded dominance. There was nothing left to command. The lake remained peaceful. Morning light reflected off the water the same way it always had, indifferent to human conflict. Life went on, but awareness lingered. That sealed letter stayed in a drawer, unanswered. Not out of spite, but because closure doesn't always require response. Sometimes, acknowledgement is enough. Sometimes, silence is the boundary. What mattered most was that the system had corrected itself. Not through force. Not through humiliation. Through process. The woman who once tried to use emergency services as leverage had learned a permanent lesson. And everyone watching learned one too. Power is not proven when others obey. It's proven when restraint is chosen, and rules are respected even when no one is watching. What happened in our neighborhood didn't stay contained for long. Stories have a way of traveling when they strike a nerve, and this one did. Not because of drama, but because it exposed something many people quietly experience: unchecked authority used by those who assume no one will challenge them. Within weeks, nearby HOAs began revising their procedures. Board members attended workshops. Emergency call policies were clarified. Some communities even invited neutral mediators to explain legal boundaries. No one wanted to be the next cautionary tale. My wife noticed the shift from a distance. Colleagues mentioned similar cases where people confused proximity to power with power itself. She used the lake incident as a teaching example during internal briefings, never naming names, focusing instead on principles. Authority exists to serve, not to dominate. Back home, neighbors felt safer asking questions. Kids played freely along shared paths again. Small freedoms returned, the kind you only notice after they've been missing. The fear that once hovered quietly over conversations dissolved. One afternoon, a new resident stopped my wife near the dock and thanked her. Not for the outcome, but for showing that calm resistance works. That you don't need to shout or threaten to stand your ground. You just need to know where the line is. That comment lingered. The former HOA president remained mostly absent. Occasionally seen at the grocery store, She kept her head down, interactions brief and polite. Time had stripped away the image she once curated. What remained was simply a person, no longer amplified by borrowed authority. The new HOA board published a revised charter, clearly outlining limits, responsibilities, and resident rights. It was approved unanimously. Something rare had happened, governance had become collaborative. As seasons changed, the lake reflected different skies, but the memory of that morning remained sharp. It served as a reminder that systems only work when people inside them respect their purpose. One phone call had revealed cracks that needed addressing. And addressing them had made everything stronger. Power, when misunderstood, creates fear. When understood, it creates stability. That was the real outcome. The call that was meant to remove someone had instead removed illusion. It had shown an entire community and many beyond it that authority is not about who you can push, but about how responsibly you act when challenged. And the story wasn't quite over yet. The morning felt ordinary again, and that was the victory. Sunlight crept across the lake, birds schemed the surface, and the dockboards warmed under bare feet. Ordinary mornings had once been interrupted by tension, by uncertainty, by the sense that someone might decide without cause that you didn't belong. That feeling was gone. My wife stood at the edge of the water, coffee in hand, not reviewing reports this time, just watching the ripples settle. The lake had always been calm, but now the community around it matched that calm. Order had returned, not because someone demanded it, but because people understood it. The HOA operated differently now. Decisions were shared. Questions were answered. Enforcement was rare and measured. Residents participated instead of hiding. What had once felt like control had transformed into stewardship. The former president never returned to power. She became a quiet footnote in a story people referenced gently, as a reminder rather than a warning. No one spoke her name with anger anymore. Lessons don't require resentment to last. Occasionally, someone would ask my wife if she ever regretted how things unfolded. She always answered the same way. Regret comes from acting against your principles. That morning, she had acted in alignment with them. The truth was simple. She hadn't used her position to punish. She had used it to protect process. And that distinction mattered more than any outcome. That 911 call, meant to intimidate, had revealed a misunderstanding that exists everywhere. Power is not something you grab. It's something entrusted to you, temporarily, conditionally, and with limits. The neighbors learned it. The HOA learned it. And one woman learned it the hardest way possible. Life moved on. New families arrived. Kids learned to fish off the dock. Laughter replaced whispered complaints. The lake returned to being just a lake. But the story stayed. Not as gossip. As guidance. Whenever someone asked why things felt different now, the answer was quiet and steady. Because one day, someone tried to misuse authority and met someone who understood it better. That understanding changed everything. Power doesn't need volume. It doesn't need threats. And it certainly doesn't need a 911 call. It needs clarity, restraint, and respect for boundaries. That morning proved that the strongest response to arrogance is calm accountability, and that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand still and let the truth speak for itself. And with that, the lake stayed peaceful. Just as it always should have been.